Hi everyone. Hopefully we are here now. Sorry about that. We had a couple of technical issues getting going. No matter how many times we do Zoom, there's always some technical issue. But thanks very much for joining us today. Very warm welcome. I'll just give a really speedy introduction as people are coming in, so we can get going, because I'm really excited and there's so much to talk about today. So for those who don't know me, I'm Helen Avery. I'm Director of Nature Programmes at the Green Finance Institute. As many of you know, our mission at the Green Finance Institute Nature Programmes is helping mobilise private capital into nature restoration and nature-based solutions in the UK. And there's a couple of things we do. We support the community of practice, the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, and are working on several initiatives with this mission in mind. Some of that work, by the way, includes an online interactive project toolkit that's going to launch in autumn to help land managers and owners understand the pathway to investment readiness in more granular detail. And we also want to showcase learnings from nature projects that have been successful in developing revenue streams that lead to repayable finance or investment models. Some of this you'll find on our website, GFI Hive. But that's why we're here today, to listen to one of the learnings and showcase one of the projects that has been successful. So with that in mind, just to introduce some of the panel that we're going to be on today, and I think we have just their headshots up here, so you can see them. We'll be hearing from Dan Turner from the Rivers Trust, Dan Hurd, Nature Finance, James Ayrton, United Utilities, and Tom Myerscough at the Wyre Rivers Trust. It's just such an incredible project, and there were so many more who were engaged on this project, and some of those are here in the audience and hopefully can add to the chat as they feel called to as we go along. I'm going to run through that project today and hear about how it came together, the structure, the interventions that took place, the financial governance impact measurement elements. We hope it's going to be really useful to you. And then really, we're here, this is an opportunity for you to ask questions. So please, could you upload your questions into the Q&A, avoid doing it in the chat just because I won't be able to keep an eye on both. So if you can put them into the Q&A, you can upvote ones that you might have wanted to ask yourself. That will just help me pick them quicker. And we've set aside 1 hour and 15 today because we really want to leave as much time as possible for you to ask those questions. Be remiss for me to not mention that this mission of trying to get out these shared learnings is shared by some of our partners, Ecosystems Knowledge Network, the Scottish Nature Finance Pioneers, and supported generously by the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. So I'm super excited. And so let's get going. And first we're going to hear from Dan Turner to share the overview of the project. So over to you, Dan.
Brilliant, thanks Helen. Thanks for giving us the opportunity to talk about the Wyre project. So I'm Dan Turner from the Rivers Trust and have been working on this project for 18 months, a couple of years, or how I like to measure it is by having 2 children in that time. So anyhow, so I think I'd just like to kind of go on to the next slide. I'd just like to really start this presentation by saying, a big thank you to all the partners in this project. And I think this is actually a really good place to start because, tackling our biodiversity and climate crisis, it's not going to be down to one organisation. Instead, it's going to require us to work collaboratively across a range of different sectors with an array of different skill sets. And I also just wanted to take the opportunity to thank the other panelists today who have brought a huge amount of knowledge to this project, but fundamentally they've brought enthusiasm, determination and commitment to the project, which is so critical to the success of innovative projects. So go on to the next slide. So I thought I would just kind of start by setting the scene really. So in 2018, the UK government published its 25-year environment plan, which sets out ambitious goals for improving our natural environment within the generation and leaving it in a better state than we found it. And that plan made clear that while public sector will continue to be an important source of funding for the natural environment, it's critical that this is alongside more private sector investment to protect and enhance our environment. And the importance of this was actually highlighted by the GFI Finance Gap for UK Nature report that illustrated a minimum of 44 billion to 97 billion in investment above current public sector commitments is required for the UK to meet its nature-related outcomes in the next 10 years. So go on to the next slide. So I guess you know, a bit of background to this project. So I guess the foundation of the Wyre NFM project was set post their 2015 floods, in which Co-op Insurance and United Utilities discussed how they could tackle flood risk together. And the Wyre NFM project was then initiated in 2019 by a group of partners, including United Utilities, the Rivers Trust, Floodring, Co-op Insurance, and the Environment Agency, to consider whether it is possible to create a commercial business case for natural flood management intervention within an upland river catchment. The Wyre NFM project became one of the successful 4 pilot nature-based investment projects across England, which received development grant funding from Esme Fairbairn Foundation in partnership with DEFRA and the Environment Agency. And the aim of these pilot projects is to test whether and how private investment capital can be blended with public sector funding to finance natural landscape restoration through the development of monetizable ecosystem services such as natural flood management. So just go on to the next slide. So why the Wyre? Well, the Wyre is located in the northwest of England in Lancashire, and it drains from the Forest of Bowland, and it is characteristic of many upland river systems. And there are several flood affected communities in the catchment. Churchtown have experienced a 1 in 50 year flood event 4 times in the last 20 years. And obviously this has had devastating impact on the local community. And the economic cost alone to insurers from a 1 in 50 year flood event is just shy of 2 million. Just next slide. So, and we know that, you know, hard engineered flood risk management solutions alone will not address our future flood risk challenges and must be supplemented by natural solutions, and mechanisms to finance the implementation of NFM at scale in the UK still remains a significant barrier to uptake. So initially, if we go on to the next slide, we modelled the catchment, and that demonstrated that a 70-hectare, highly targeted NFM intervention in the upper catchment could significantly reduce flooding to Churchtown. And all of those NFM interventions are well recognised and have the ability to intercept, slow and hold water. Next slide. But we also know these interventions also provide several other benefits. If we just jump onto the next slide, including, you know, habitat creation, improvements in water quality, and through the tree planting and peatland work we're doing, you know, sequester a huge amount of carbon, but also those, you know, social benefits as well, and the reduced stresses and strains of people at flood risk. So go on to the next slide. So Dan Hurd is going to speak a lot more about the kind of financial model and the transactional structure, but I thought I'd just focus on kind of 3 main aspects of kind of innovation that we're really proud to see in this project. So first is this adaptive management. So traditionally, funding for NFN has been, you know, for capital works only. But what we have done is enabled to introduce a 6-year adaptive management phase to allow us to tweak the interventions where necessary so that they are more effective. And this really does ensure that we are delivering a high quality service. And I think that's a really unique part of this project. Secondly is the performance metric. The buyer's payments are all based on a performance metric, which is based on flood risk reduction that is delivered by the project. And this is based on some subcatchment monitoring of the NFM interventions. And finally is that kind of biodiversity metric. So at the time, biodiversity net gain wasn't, you know, really established, so it was hard to monetize the biodiversity. Therefore, we created an impact adjusted finance mechanism in which if we demonstrate a biodiversity gain in relation to a biodiversity metric that we've created, the institutional investors in this project will reduce their interest rates. And these payments will all be passed through to the farmers, actually, through a kind of payments by results mechanism. So yeah, if we just go on to the final slide. So this is quite a high level kind of project process, really, from inception to completion. And it just illustrates some of the key steps we went through. And these will be discussed in more detail by the other panelists. So I thought I'd just finish really with a bit of a take-home message. And you know, the project has been a huge success, but it's by no means perfect. But what I do think it has done is set the foundations for what is possible. And I think if we really want to meaningfully tackle our biodiversity crisis and climate crisis, we all need to get a bit more comfortable with risk, because ultimately the risk of not doing something is far more risky than having a go at tackling the problem head on. So hopefully that's given you a good overview of the project, and I'll now pass on to Dan Hurd.
Thanks very much, Dan. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, and I think we'll move straight on to the next slide in the interest of time. So Dan mentioned this is actually a £1.5 million project, and one of the key bits of learning from it was, could we bring in external private investment into this type of project? And that is something we managed to do. So this here on the slide is a summary of how we've raised the 1.5 million. And you can see it's through a blended finance mechanism. There's approximately 526k of effectively public funding for the tree planting programme. That came through the Woodland Trust, through the Northern Forest programme set up by DEFRA. The Woodland Trust themselves actually provided some funding for some of the hedgerow planting, an agreed percentage of that. And that left a balance of 850,000 to be raised through external private capital. So it's that bit which we had to go into the market for. But you've effectively there in this deal, this quite small deal, got a combination of public sector, third sector and private sector funding. And to me, that is what we mean when we talk about blended finance. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So the challenge here, as well as putting all the bringing all the stakeholders together, as Dan's just explained, and setting up all the contracts, is where do we raise £850,000 of private capital from? So we hear quite a lot about there's plenty of capital in the market, but who are the typical investors for a smallish project, very innovative, unproven type project of this scale, where actually you're investing in a newly formed special purpose vehicle, which was a community interest company we set up. You know, where are we going to get this money from? So I think there are actually in the market at the moment potentially 5 different sources of investment in natural capital. You might start at the top and talk about large natural capital investment funds. So here we're talking about people like maybe Pollination, Mirova, Federated Hermes, 1 or 2 other large, well-established international investment firms talking about investing in nature and finance. They're the sort of the guys who are thinking about bringing the hundreds of millions and billions into restore nature around the world. Well, on this project, I did talk to a couple of those, and quite understandably, they said this is very interesting, but far too small. So we knew they weren't going to be the investors in this category. Now, second on the list is the Big Nature Impact Fund, which is a new fund that's been established by, initiated by DEFRA, where DEFRA are putting 30 million of upfront funding in, and a contract's been awarded to, I think it's confidential, so I won't mention who, but a fund manager to find another 60 million to match with DEFRA's 30. So hopefully by later in 2022, we're going to have a £90 million Big Nature Impact Fund available in the UK to invest in nature-based projects and NERF projects. But obviously when we were doing the Wyre, that fund wasn't yet in existence. In fact, it still isn't set up right now. So we then had to look somewhere else, and we focused really on impact investment funds. And these are typically charitable foundations, family trusts, who have over the last 10-15 years been very active investing in the social investment space, and who are increasingly gearing their investment strategy towards nature and the environment. And my work at Triodos, we know these people very, very well. We've then got the bottom 2 categories, which is us, the individuals. You know, some of us are high net worth, some of us aren't, but we are potential investors in nature. And there's a huge motivation amongst the general public to restore nature and biodiversity and reduce flood risk. And there are means whereby you can invest in those sorts of projects. Now, we took the view that on this one, as a pilot, we should be focusing on just a few high net worth individuals who were capable of really understanding the risks and doing their own due diligence. So working closely with Triodos Bank, we identified a number of high net worths, and we were successful in bringing some of those into this project. Longer term, there is a potential to do crowdfunding, investment crowdfunding for nature-based investments. That is a highly regulated activity because most of these projects will be unlisted private investments. And really that can only be done through regulated crowdfunding platforms such as Triodos, Abundance, FX, etc. But there is a future potential for raising money from the general public. So the two items in red there is where we got the money from. On to the next slide, please, Phoebe. So what we did to raise the 850, we constructed two complementary loan facilities, one for the institutions and one for the high net worth individuals. And we raised 650k from 5 funds. The largest investor was the Esme Fairburn Social Investment Fund, which was brilliant really, because Esme initially funded this pilot from their grant funding side. So it was great to see the circle completed with them making a significant investment through one of their funds into it. And that brought in 4 other impact investors. And actually interesting in the impact investment market, many of the investors work very collaboratively. They're very happy to share investments, share due diligence, and work together to share the risk. And I think that's a little message that could be passed across to the commercial sector actually. So you can actually create quite a collaborative, positive investment process by working that way. We also brought in 4 high net worth individuals, each invested £50,000 each. So that's where we got the 850 from. Now the two facilities work very well together because they effectively interlock, in that the SITR facility attracts social investment tax relief, which means the investors get a 30% tax refund on their investment. But that facility must be bottom of the pile in terms of security. So it's almost like equity. So that money was drawn down on day one. It attracts tax relief and it is junior to the other facility. So the institutional facility ranks senior to the SITR, which means that if the business went bust, the institutional investors would be paid out first. So there's just a little bit of extra layer of security below the institutions here. Now both facilities were 9-year facilities at 6%. The funding is drawn down over the first 3 years as the interventions are invested in the ground, and they're repaid between years 4 and 9. The impact investors agreed to an incentive reduction in interest rate of 1% if we could demonstrate that we'd hit certain biodiversity metrics within the model. And some of those incentives are passed through to the landowners. So part of that interest rate sharing is shared between the project, SPV, and the landowner. So this is again trying to introduce some biodiversity incentive into the whole thing. So on to the next slide, please, Phoebe. Talking about investment terms just on the last slide is interesting, but it doesn't really mean anything because the return on your investment and whether you should make it or not really depends on the particular risks of the investment. And this is an interesting project in that what we've had to do all the way through, and the reason it's taken so long actually to do, is it's all about allocating the risks between the various stakeholder groups. If you imagine this project, it's really a combination of bringing 4 lots of stakeholders together. We've got buyers of ecosystem services, and Jim Ayrton from United Utilities will give that perspective in a moment. But the buyers want to buy flood risk reduction, but they don't want to take all the risk. So that's their starting point. We've then got landowners who might well be prepared to host and maintain these interventions, and they want paying for it. But again, the landowners have been used to government subsidies. They are quite hard to shift into these sorts of schemes, as many of you working on projects will know. So we need to try and make this very, very attractive for landowners to become early adopters of this stuff. So the landowners don't really want to be taking financial risk. They haven't been used to that. The Rivers Trust is, and the Wyre Rivers Trust, Tom speaking next, are national charities. And we don't want national charities taking financial risk either. They certainly can take reputational risk, because the Rivers Trust have put this project together, and Tom, who's speaking next, will be delivering it. So the whole purpose of bringing external investment into this is to take some of the risk away from those 3 other parties and provide upfront funding for the overall intervention and take enough of the risk away in the whole project that you can bring the buyers and the landowners on board. So this little graphic I think is quite interesting in that you can see here, taking the first one, the construction delivery risk rests largely with the investors. And the reason for that is that the investors are putting all their money in up front. The buyers will only pay for the interventions if they are delivered. And we have a clause in the buyer contract which says 80% of the agreed interventions must be delivered by the end of year 3. If that isn't the case, the buyers can pull out of the whole deal. And that will mean the investors will lose all the money they've put in. So that's why the buyers have some risk, because they'll be paying year 1, year 2. The investors have quite a lot of risk because they're funding all the interventions that are going in the first 3 years. The landowners aren't really taking much risk because someone else is funding those interventions, albeit on their land. They're getting paid for those, and it would be disappointing for it to fall over at year 3, but not disastrous for them. The Rivers Trust aren't taking any financial risk, but of course they're taking a huge reputational risk because Tom, who's speaking next, his job is to get those interventions in the ground in the first 3 years. And as Dan pointed out, NFM performance risks also are shared between buyers and investors. We have a performance metric which kicks in year 6. So for the first 5 years, we're really monitoring the performance of this intervention, doing some adaptive management, gathering the data. During that time, the buyers are paying their annual fee. The investors have already invested all their money. But from year 6 onwards, if it's proven not to be working, the buyers can then pull out, which means the investors wouldn't get their repayments in years 6, 7, 8, and 9. So again, the investors are taking a reasonable amount of risk in all this. So you've got to look at that in the context of a 9-year loan at 6% and say, is that for me or not? Because I did have a few people saying 6% sounds quite high for a deal like this. We've got Environment Agency, United Utilities as buyers. What could possibly go wrong? Well, I think I've just explained quite a few risks there that investors are actually taking in this deal. And part of the construction of this is about that risk allocation. Next slide, please, Phoebe. So we'll just finish with one groundbreaker in this deal that we did manage to use was the use of social investment tax relief, which is a very little known relief introduced in 2015, mainly for the social investment sector. It hasn't been used very much. And interestingly, it's only available for charities and social enterprises, including community interest companies, which we've used here. And very interestingly, it can apply both to equity, but also importantly to debt instruments issued by a charity or a social enterprise. And it gives quite an attractive tax relief to investors of 30% of your investment back, plus capital gains and inheritance tax advantages. So if we can use more SITR on some of these smaller pilot-based projects, that has a great opportunity to bring high net worth private investors into this space. Because the tax relief effectively is compensating them for some of those risks that I've just talked about. So I'll finish there now and pass on to Tom Myerscough, who's going to talk about things on the ground.
Thanks, Dan. Hi everyone, I'm Tom Myerscough. I'm the General Manager at the Wyre Trust. Next slide, please. So I was asked to sort of look at some of the challenges of delivering NFM at a catchment scale. So there are many, as people will know, but a lot of them can be easily distilled. So one of the main challenges that we see are existing obligations on the land. This can be from government schemes such as stewardship or other private projects. There are obviously competing conservation priorities sometimes, so we have to make sure we balance them well. There is often a lack of funding to take projects from concept to completion for opportunities and then for monitoring. So if we do have sorry, can we just go back? If there is an opportunity there, which needs to be sort of dealt with in the next 6 months, often the funding isn't there to do that. So that project opportunity can be missed. And a good example of that might be where a developer has room on a piece of land that they're developing. But if we can't hit the timescale, then the project won't go forward. And the lack of money for monitoring is something that's seen across conservation projects in general. So my usual point of let's have more money for monitoring so we can find out how successful our projects actually are. There is a lack of evidence of project successes, which is stems from that lack of money or lack of funding for monitoring. There can be a lack of landowner and community support for projects. Fortunately, it's not the case in this instance, but there are areas where NFM isn't welcomed. and there is obviously support for outdated practices such as dredging that are sort of unsustainable and mainly ineffective, which means that people don't want to see NFM, they just want to see the same old. Again, not an issue in the Upper Wyre, but I do know it's an issue further across the country. Next slide, please. So how do these challenges manifest themselves? Well, there are a large amount of farms in the Upper Wyre that are delivering countryside stewardship, and this can prevent the delivery of features where they're most needed. So often our features are going to be in the marginal areas of fields, but if that entire field's in countryside stewardship and we want to take effectively 100 square metres out of it, then the farmers will have to repay the funding that they've received for that area for the last up to 10 years, 15 years in some cases. So obviously they're not keen on that. Funding periods are often not aligned with time periods for delivery. So prime example is tree planting. If you get money for tree planting in November, it's going to be very difficult to do all the due diligence that you need by February in order to get these trees in the ground. So the funding periods do need better alignment. There isn't enough funding for effective monitoring. As I was saying, monitoring and science in general is very difficult. So the funding needs to be there to support that work. And as I said, the funding isn't always available when the opportunities arise. The NFM evidence base is still in its infancy. It's getting better, and we hope that this project will help to provide further evidence along with all the other projects across the country. But yes, it's still very infant in that sense. And yeah, as we discussed, landowners and communities might not be supportive of projects in the first instance. That can cause delays. Fortunately, we were pushing an open door in the Wyre, but in other areas I've seen that there can be big delays whilst communities are convinced that this is a route to go down, and then the traditional practices are still supported in some subcatchments, meaning that they don't want to see NFM. Next slide, please. So obviously there's a great importance of working with farmers, landowners, land managers and communities. It is vitally important that we distinguish between these groups, because in some cases a farmer or land manager may not have ultimate control over the land, where they're a tenant, and we have a lot of tenant farms in the Upper Wyre and colder catchments. So we have to work with the landowner there as well to ensure that we're hitting everyone's priorities. In other cases, farmers have ultimate control, which can be beneficial. It can also be disbenefit, where they change their mind fairly regularly, but we try and get around that as best we can. By working with the groups, we can engender a sense of ownership in the interventions which are delivered, which is really useful, because it means that people want to see them working in the landscape, and they'll tell us about them working in most cases. And landowners in general are in need of diverse income streams, and some of that can be provided by NFM payments, by results, carbon revenue, things like that. So this is sort of placing a piece in that jigsaw of these income streams as they move forward beyond basic payment being removed from them. And then by working with farming cluster groups, we can show that interventions are part of the bigger picture. So it becomes a bit of a community activity in that instance. Working in one subcatchment, you can quickly get 5, 6, 7 landowners involved just because one person has been involved in the middle of the subcatchment, and they want to actually do their bit to ensure that they're all working together, which is really good to see. Next slide, please. So there are numerous benefits of actually working with these groups. For the practitioner, you've got access to a wealth of local knowledge and contacts. We can get onto other farmers just by working with farmers in the first instance. We are working with and on behalf of the community, which everybody likes to see. You have eyes on the ground, so things that need to happen, or areas where you might not see things happening in terms of sort of overland flows and things like that. The farmers can help you, direct you to where you need to do these interventions. We get a lot of anecdotal evidence. So where we've delivered NFM features in the past, we've been told that they're having a real impact, and then you get honest answers. So if things are rubbish, then they'll tell you about it, and you have to alter it pretty quickly. And obviously for the land manager, they have different revenue streams. They have reduced farming costs. They can a lot of capital items sort of brought onto their farms in terms of fences and hedges and tracks and things like that. They have increased biodiversity and habitat values. There is appreciation of the value of their work from communities, whether, you know, even if they're sort of 10 miles away downstream, they still value it highly, and they get increased social interaction and interaction with peers by working as part of a group. Next slide, please. So just in terms of the performance monitoring for the project, we'll be undertaking performance monitoring, you know, directed by the KIC. We use various equipment, including flumes, level loggers, topographical surveys, time-lapse photography and rainfall monitoring. So that picture shows a stage board near a leaky dam. It's been taken by time-lapse photography during Storm Kira. You can see that leaky dam is working quite effectively there, storing water. So the monitoring will inform annual and project reporting on the effectiveness of the interventions at reducing or delaying peak flow during a 1 in 50-year flood event. And we will do it in 2 small subcatchments as a proxy for the project area, because obviously the catchment area is very large, so it'll be difficult to cover the entire area and costly. So the performance metrics are the interventions functioning as designed, so are they not full during smaller events? And then is there a reduction or delay in peak flow? And we've seen that we can certainly reduce levels by 10 to 20% in some of our interventions. So it's some of the reason that flow will also be delayed. So in year, what does it mean for the project? Well, in year, if in years 1 to 5 the metrics aren't met, then we can start doing adaptive management to ensure that the interventions are working more effectively. And then between years 6 and 9, if the performance metrics aren't met, a contract review process will be triggered. Next slide, please. So in terms of maintenance, the land managers are being paid to host and maintain interventions for 9 years. The sellers or the land managers will be visited annually to assess NFM interventions and whether they've been maintained properly. And then obviously they'll be paid based on meeting the obligations in the agreement. And we expect that will be quite a straightforward process. And you know, we'll work with the farmers and land managers to ensure that things are done fairly. And obviously we can make adjustments where the obligations are not met if things aren't maintained. Obviously, if there's an extremely large flood event and things get broken or washed out or anything like that, then there are clauses in our contracts to ensure that we can pay to replace these interventions where they might be destroyed, and it's not it's at no fault of the farmer or land manager. The initial agreements with the sellers are for 9 years, and there will be options to extend beyond that. And the landowners see that as being largely positive, although we have had some questions around these interventions being in the landscape for a long period of time and farmers not been able to sort of get out of that agreement if they want to. So we're just working through those issues at the minute. So I'll pass on to James now.
Hi all. Yeah, so I'm Jim Ayrton from United Utilities. So we've been involved in this project kind of right from the outset, really working with the Rivers Trust and some of the other organisations to see how we can try and drive that forward. Sorry. Well, I can't quite see anything changing, but that's fine. I can go through some of our key activity. Oh yeah, and then next one, please. So in terms of our interest in kind of why we want to get involved in kind of natural flood management and kind of generally in investment in nature-based solutions is very much around kind of our position in what we're trying to deliver and the impact of kind of changing natural environment on United Utilities. We're obviously a water company, and we also have significant assets dealing with wastewater. So kind of we have a really close interaction with natural environment, and looking at the most effective way to drive that improvement is really important to us. So if we look at some of the really key challenges that we've got going on at the moment, I think everyone's aware of the challenge associated with climate change. That's leading to changes in weather patterns, and that puts a really big strain on our assets. So fundamentally, we have kind of our wastewater network assets that are taking away water and draining kind of areas that are experiencing far higher levels of rainfall and bigger strain on kind of their ability to do that. But we're also obviously an asset owner. We have several treatment works, pumping stations, etc., within these catchments that have suffered from those kind of four flooding events over the last 20 years. And that has an impact on service that we can provide to our customers, as well as obviously a financial cost in restoring those assets into operation. So kind of how we can mitigate against that climate change impact is really key. And fundamentally, we know that we can't do it alone. Apologies, the postman didn't get the message that I was here, obviously. But fundamentally, we can't do that alone, and we need to kind of engage with broader partners as to how we can actually deliver the interventions that we need to across catchments to deliver those kind of multiple benefits for society. And that ties in with that other side of that we have this population growth is another key challenge. That adds more pressure to our assets, both in the context of what our assets are required to deliver in the growing population there, but also its development that's kind of concreting over areas of landscape, reducing the amount of kind of ability for water to run off, and therefore fundamentally changing the way that we're managing that quantity of water. So it's really important for us to kind of link in with other organisations, manage that impact and address some of these challenges going forward. So we've got our catchment systems thinking approach, CAST, which is very much around trying to understand how we can drive these multifunctional benefits, align with multiple stakeholders, because equally nature-based solutions are brilliant things, but I think there's quite often a perception that they might be cheaper to deliver, and sometimes that's the case, which is great. But not always. They can actually still be quite expensive to deliver the specific interventions or the specific needs of any individual organisation. And one of the key challenges with that is that nature-based solutions deliver this kind of host of multiple benefits, which is a really positive thing and delivers a lot of additional value. But actually, water company customers are kind of paying for a particular service from water companies, and all of those other benefits, as great as they may be, are not our kind of core remit to deliver, and we need to be very focused on spending our customer money in the most efficient way that we can. Therefore, in order to kind of really invest in nature-based solutions effectively, we need to work with other organisations to align multiple different organisations' interest to really take that forward. And then that also allows us to really maximise those ecosystem services and share that risk really effectively. We'll move on to the next one, please. So specifically in terms of the benefits that United Utilities is kind of getting out of this project, and the reason why we've been really interested in investing in this, as I mentioned, we've got about 30 sites and assets kind of within the catchment that's going to be impacted by these NFM interventions, and they have been impacted by past flooding in that catchment, and that has obviously had a significant financial cost. So what we did in terms of kind of understanding that is, as Dan mentioned earlier, the project model the impact in terms of the flooding and the flow impact that the natural flood management interventions would deliver, and that came out with a value of kind of between 5 and 15% smaller, based on all of that modelling information. So we took a number of about 10% as being a middle ground value through that. And we did some modelling based on our kind of expected frequency of flooding events that would impact on our assets. And we did that over a 120-year period, which gave us a view as to kind of over that time frame, which is kind of our opinion as to a reasonable length that we would expect these natural assets to be able to work over, was we could calculate the expected financial impact. And we were then able to kind of validate that against the cost we'd actually occurred in past flooding events and get a fairly good calibration across those numbers. So based on that, we were able to kind of an annualized period, and that we were able to then convert into a value that we were prepared to pay effectively on an annual basis into the Wyre kick for the benefits that were accrued as a result of the natural flood management interventions. Now, because of the nature of this project and how early it is in our strategic impact, we were actually able to kind of inflate the figure we could potentially put in by using that whole 120-year benefit and moving that forward to the front end of the project. I guess it's an important point to say that's not necessarily going to be that sustainable as an ongoing basis, so that I think when we come on to the future development of the project, kind of understanding how we can drive in additional revenue streams to reduce that impact will be important. But in context of the really strategic nature of this project and proving this as a method of working, there was real benefit to us in kind of getting that to go forward. But it's also really important to say, to demonstrate that the benefit of this project to United Utilities would have in no way paid for the actual delivery of the overall project. So the fact that you have this kick that can bring organisations together and kind of share that cost across, bringing in funding for the kind of woodland opportunity, but also multiple beneficiaries. So we've obviously got Floodry, Wyre Borough Council, RFCC and Environment Agency investing jointly with us. That's the reason this can happen. And I think it's true to say that none of those organisations would have been able to kind of finance and fund the delivery of these interventions in isolation. So that core element of bringing that together is absolutely key. And go on to the next one, please. So just, I guess, a couple of key points just to really highlight that I think we've probably covered quite a lot of. Partnership and robust commercial mechanisms, really important. No one emission could really deliver this kind of itself. And then there's also a really key element around the kind of commercial mechanisms and how they work. So actually the delivery of natural flood management is relatively new. It's not an area we have a lot of expertise in, and therefore the kind of outcomes that we're going to get from that are a little bit more uncertain, and I think that came through from some of the information Tom was talking through as well. So the risk mechanisms that we have, that Dan was going through around you know, the kind of construction challenges and the mitigation to the buyers group and the option to withdraw if we can't actually get these projects into the ground is really important. But then also the performance monitoring that's happening is really key to firstly understand and build that evidence case for the NFM benefit, but also it does give us that assurity that actually if these aren't delivering the benefits we're expecting, that risk with the investor is quite an appealing proposition to allow us to do that, because we've got kind of effectively a double share going on in the fact we're sharing the costs across the buyers consortium, but we're also sharing it then with the investor in terms of that risk of delivery, which kind of helps to make that business case internally to invest in those. And those are kind of really important points in how the structure works. And then just to move on to kind of, I guess, a couple of key next steps on the next slide around what we think the potential to take this forward. I think we need to have a look at the learning from the project, how we can scale it and how we can take it forward. I think we've done some brilliant work across all the organisations, and take the opportunity to thank Dan as well, and Turner, for all the work he's put in for driving this on. But there are still some challenges with how it's worked, and I think a lot of the organisers and everything have kind of been really motivated to make this happen strategically, which has helped drive it over. But we need to kind of iron out some of those challenges and how we can actually really make that scalable to drive it further forward. And then I think linking into the NFM point and building our understanding of that's also really key, because we talked about United Utilities kind of asset base and protecting that. We believe there will be a benefit to our sewerage network performance through this. However, we don't really have the modelling capability to quantify that at the moment. So one of the things we'd really like to do is understand how NFM interlinks with that catchment in a broader way to really allow us to capture the full range of benefits that exist there, and then open up therefore kind of further opportunities for how we can invest in this sort of opportunity and drive it forward. And that's kind of covered everything from my perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, James, and thanks, Dan and Tom. There's a lot of information there. I appreciate if you're watching. So I can't see the chat, but presumably there's questions on the chat like, will I be able to see the slides? And the question is, the answer to that is yes, we're going to share the slides from today. There will be, obviously it's being recorded, this session, and that will be up early next week on the Hive events page. There's lots of questions that the panel here have kindly been answering in the Q&A. So we will also take a snapshot of those and we can put them in a document and put it with the event, just to make sure if you haven't had a chance to sort of read some of those questions that have already been asked and already been answered kindly by the team. So given there's so many questions still, I think we'll just get going with some of those. And if there are questions you've answered, panelists, that you think are worth sort of talking through, I'm very happy if you just give me a wave. I'm just going to switch my view to gallery so I can see you all, and just give me a wave and let me know if there's something you want to answer. So there's one here, actually, I think there was one that Tom, you mentioned you might answer from Steve on the other side, Steve Barge. Interesting that investment from individuals was not seen as suitable. How does this align with volunteering, as this is a great way to get individuals to invest in kind and effectively reduce the required capital investment? Volunteering would then make individual investment viable, ? Tom, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept. I wanted to bring Dan Herding on that as well, because there will be a hell of a lot of volunteering that takes place as part of this project. So we'll have effectively teams of volunteers going out delivering near enough all of these interventions. But we haven't considered that aspect of it, had we really, Dan, about sort of reducing, sort of using that in-kind value to reduce the investment.
No, we haven't. I think it was probably only right to cost up the capex, as if we're going to have to pay for everything, and be realistic actually about some of the material increase prices post-Brexit, post-pandemic, and we rejigged some of the numbers, didn't we, Tom? Wood prices, for example, going up. So actually, if we're able to, or you're able to sort of harness a lot of free volunteer labour locally, that could have the impact of creating a capex saving. But you wouldn't, I don't think you'd responsibly build that into your financial model. You'd treat that as an objective to engage the community and get people involved. So it'd be a bit of upside, if you like, rather than built in, I would say.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It's a really interesting concept, though. I think maybe morally, I don't know if many of the volunteers would like to be thought of in that way. I think they just do it for, you know, being part of the community and giving a little bit back. So I don't know whether they'd like to be sort of tied into sort of agreements to do so much volunteering as well. It's interesting.
And one thing just to add is, obviously in the governance of the KIC, we wanted all the stakeholder groups to be represented, and one in particular who weren't necessarily involved in the long 18-month construction of the project was the local community. So we invited somebody from the local flood action group to come onto the board of the KIC, and I think that's just important to show there's a bit of a tie-up to the local community as the project now moves forward. It moves away from all the financial engineering and all that sort of stuff, more into actual on-the-ground delivery and involving the local community, and something Tom will be dealing with.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Dan. Thanks for the question. There's one here from Henry Crabb. I'm wondering how landowners were engaged. I see Tom's already started answering this, but I'm wondering how landowners were engaged and approached along the Wyre, and whether there was any resistance despite investors taking on a lot of the risk. I know you mentioned in there that everyone was kind of fully on board. And I'm actually interested myself, is like, why was that the case? It does feel like a bit of an anomaly. I don't know, Tom, Dan, I don't know.
Yeah, I think we had a fantastic existing relationship with a lot of the farmers and landowners in the upper catchment. As is the case with most places in the country, we've got areas where there used to be lots of small farms that have now sort of been absorbed into larger farms. So the number of farmers we have to deal with is sort of reduced, which means that we sort of know quite a lot of them now. So they were already aware of this process. We had a DEFRA Community Fund NFM project prior to this. We took them out to see all the stuff we'd done. We sat them down and discussed it with them, and, you know, discussed how they might benefit from doing this kind of stuff on their land. And then we had an NFM officer that went out and sat down with them, and then went around the whole farm, produced a very detailed report, and then we sat and discussed it with them. And by doing that process, we sort of engage them along the way, and then they decide what they want to do as part of, which fits into their farm business model.
Fantastic.
I'll just maybe just come in, Helen,
yeah, go for it, Dan.
and just to add to that, I think, yeah, it's vital that we have a local organisation. I think actually, the farmers really welcome that. But I think just adding on to kind of, was there any resistance? I think the major resistance is around that kind of uncertainty as we go through the agricultural transition period with elms on the horizon. That is a massive uncertainty. And I think, farmers are in a really, really tricky position. So the fertilizer prices, huge now, and other influencing impacts on the agricultural sector is making it really hard to do long-term business planning. So I think it's, it is our responsibility as a collective to try and, help and kind of support farmers through this transition period. So I think this is a really good mechanism to, support farmers long-term.
Thank you. There's one from Chris Hayes, I think is worth sort of bringing up to the top a bit, because it's appreciative that there are other beneficiaries involved in this that are buyers of ecosystem services that we haven't sort of touched on in a lot of detail. And so Chris says, please can someone just explain how flood-re fit into the project? Dan, is that you?
Yeah, happy to do that. Obviously, when areas flood, people claim on insurance, and insurers reinsure, and then they reinsure. And ultimately, someone somewhere picks up the tab. And ultimately, when you look at the insurance industry, that rests with Lloyd's of London and reinsurers in enormous organisations based in Switzerland. So your local insurance company doesn't really pay out because it's laid off the risk. So we thought at the start of this, surely the insurance sector generally should be interested in reducing flood risk. And we talked to some insurance companies, and they pointed us towards reinsurers and flood-re. And flood-re are a government organisation set up to enable people in flood-affected areas to afford flood risk protection, where they couldn't generally get that in the market. And part of their remit is to make sure that they're not required in 25 years' time. So they've got a strategy, flood-re, of supporting innovative flood risk reduction measures, whether that's financial mechanisms or actual things like natural flood management. So they were very interested in supporting this project. They said, you're not going to get Lloyd's of London being a buyer of this. It's a tiny pilot, but we can step in and act as proxy for the insurance industry. And at the same time, we can gather some data, learn more about natural flood management, understand actually what we're being asked to do as a buyer. And maybe on the next project, which might be bigger, we can help engage more of the general reinsurers. So they played a really vital role actually as a buyer, and a lot of credit goes to their team for sticking with it all the way through and being one of the 5 buyers.
Thanks, Dan. There's a question here from Henry Crabb. James, I think you put your hand up to answer this. In areas where there are moratoriums on development due to phosphate nitrate pollution, such as around the Solent and Somerset levels, there's a real need for projects such as the Wyre, as NFM can be stacked up with mitigation of surface runoff, water runoff. Do you think the need for nutrient neutrality in these particular areas could make finding investment more achievable, especially from developers themselves who are looking for phosphate offsets, or how might this impact a financial model for projects in these areas? Great question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we're doing quite a lot of work on nutrient neutrality at the moment. It's a key area that's actually probably rising up in the interest, and I must admit in the Northwest it's not something we've had a particular challenge with, although we've now got some designated areas, so starting to get far more involved in it. And fundamentally, in terms of the attracting investment point, I mean, Dan Hurd is far more expert in this than I am, but they need to be able to see where the return on investment is coming from. So the key challenge is actually developing the buyers for the ecosystem services that can kind of pay into this structure and deliver that. And as I kind of alluded to in the presentation, actually diversifying what services you can sell to generate as much kind of breadth in the funding that's coming in makes that far more achievable to deliver that, because you're spreading that burden and you're spreading that risk across a range of organisations. So we have other projects where we are investing directly in catchment measures for water quality benefit to kind of offset our regulatory obligations and the impact of our wastewater treatment works. that's one route that could be brought in. And actually, I think the use of nutrient neutrality then really does open up the concept for developers as to how they can kind of work in that space as well. I think there are a few challenges we need to work through in that, in the sets need to be delivered long term and have to kind of have guaranteed delivery over, I think, about 100-year life period to kind of link in with that. So how you kind of manage the longevity of making that, and then also how the risk is managed associated with that if those offsets are eventually proven, and who that sits with in terms of the developer versus the kick, are all things that need to be considered. But I think as a fundamental principle, kind of being allowed to align those additional benefits into this type of model absolutely makes it more viable, and it provides a far kind of broader range of services, which makes it more applicable to a wider range of locations as well.
Thanks, James. There's a few here from Archie Brugglesbryes. I know, Dan, you're typing an answer. Do you want to just sort of speak the answer to save you furiously typing? The question is, how were the payments to landowners calculated? Were they varied based on location, delivery potential of the specific intervention? Did you build in a facility to vary these values over the life of the intervention agreements? For example, if the modelling proved to undervalue the intervention?
Yeah, some really good points there, Archie. One thing is obviously NFM is place-based. We've got to deliver it in the right place in the catchment to be effective. I think for me, one of the really important things at the start of this project is we weren't going to deliver the cheapest intervention that was most effective, because that is not progress. You know what I mean? We might as well just deliver a hard engineered solution at that point. What we really want to see is an integrated catchment solution that is delivering for the landscape. So we didn't really want to get into that under and overvaluation of the effectiveness of intervention, because fundamentally it's about delivering a catchment vision. In terms of this place-based, that, as I said, that is adds a complexity to this project, but we have allowed a 20% flexibility for the Wyre Rivers Trust to deliver NFM opportunities outside the priority areas. So that's a good mechanism that we've allowed. The costs were based on income forgone. Hands up, I don't like income forgone, and I think we desperately need to move away from income forgone. But at the time, this is only kind of mechanism we had. However, we have added an element of payments by results into this project, which I think is a welcome direction for this. And I think in future projects, that's something that we really need to work on going forward. Hopefully that answers your question.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. There's a question from Kate Russell, who has just also requested that we all speak a bit more clearly. With our accents, I don't know what it is. Was there any discussion with land managers about the potential impact on their farming businesses of re-wetting the land? There could be long-term adverse impacts. If there were, can the land manager pull out? That sounds like one for you, Tom.
Yeah, so we had discussed this in detail with the land manager, and a lot of the interventions aren't really going to re-wet the land that much, as it will take place within the the confines of the channels of the streams generally, and where we've got things like kested hedges or bunded hedges where the land will be wet. We've discussed that in detail with them, and they understand that that's going to happen, and that's why we're doing the project. And we were fairly clear that the aim of this project is to actually re-wet bits of the land and get water to be stored during the times when we need it to be stored in the catchment. So yeah, the farmers are generally happy with that, and the one thing that they've all got in common up there is that they have a lot of water, and that's how they can they can get some funding out of that, so an income stream out of that. So yeah.
Maybe just to add to that, I think it's also really important that as practitioners and deliveries of these things, we make sure that farmers are going into these agreements with their eyes wide open. It's our responsibility to do that. So whether that's from natural flood management, but also carbon, is to make sure that they are fully aware of what they are signing up to. But yeah, I think as Tom says, this, it's a fantastic opportunity to, create a new revenue stream for those farm businesses. And I think also, you know, it's also our responsibility to look for those areas of commonality with farmers and where those opportunities are that kind of actually, you know, complement their business as well. So, and I think, you know, there's far more opportunities in the landscape that we are missing that we can do much more with. So just add a bit more weight to that.
Thanks, Dan. There's a question here, but I think it is relevant because we haven't really touched on it. Was any funding sought from the local communities that are likely to be affected by flooding? So the role of the local council. Oh, Tom, I see you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, there was a question from an anonymous attendee about how do we encourage clustering. Just quickly to say that was already in place. We had a facilitation group in the upper Wyre catchment, which had been in place since 2018. So the farmers were used to sort of working together and working as a wider community.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so back to this question of the role of the local community, which I've now seen disappear. Does anyone want to answer that one?
Yeah, I mean, I can answer that and probably hand over to Dan after that. Yeah, so obviously the Wyre Council are one of the buyers of ecosystem services. I think that's actually a great success for the project, actually, because obviously, you know, restricted council budgets. I think it shows, you know, the value of this project to the Wyre Council, and obviously Tom and the Wyre Rivers Trust do a lot of work with the local flood affected community as well. I think in future, I think there is quite innovative ways that we can engage communities, flood affected communities more in this. So, you know, through a crowdsourced funding platform or whatever. But yeah, that's kind of the approach that we took. And we've also got, as Dan said before, on the board of directors, we have got a community representative on that.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think it's important we all distinguish between buyers and investors. You know, the Wyre Council are a buyer of ecosystem services, so they're buying natural flood management risk for their community. In terms of investment, raising the 850, it would have been wonderful to have done a crowdfunding campaign locally in the Wyre, maybe in the wider Lancashire, and raise that 850k from ordinary people in the area and let them have that loan. However, we took the view that this is a early stage, quite high risk pilot project, and actually raising 850 from members of the public in quite a rural area would be quite a challenge. So instead, we took a more pragmatic approach and said, let's make sure we secure the investment, because there's plenty of other priorities to deliver in this project alongside where do we get the money from. But in future, no reason why not. But crowdfunding from the public is a highly regulated activity, and you don't want very, very high risk propositions being put to members of the public, which are going to go wrong. So,
thanks, Dan. I think there'll be a lovely future webinar, just have you back in again for good measure, about crowdfunding and talk about that in more detail. Tom, I see you have your hand up. Is there a question you've spied?
It was just to add to that, respond to that question. A couple of key things there. The investment at Wyre Council is particularly novel because actually the flood risk that's received in Churchtown stems from Lancaster City Council area. So Wyre Council has actually invested in something that's be delivered outside of their council boundary to benefit their own constituents, as it were. So that is really novel. And the second thing to remember is when discussing public investment in this is that people in Churchtown and St Michael's and Garstang do get flooded have already paid for their flood defences through levies on their tax, on council tax. So we thought that it wasn't particularly wise to ask them for more money to stop their houses from flooding.
Thanks, Tom. Sticking with buyers, Constantina Kaluri says, in terms of aggregating buyers, did each buyer propose an amount from the individual assessment of project value and stacking those until the cost of projects covered, or was it more driven by the kick in making up these investment proposals to potential buyers?
So I could probably cover that one. Yeah, I guess it was an element of both, in the sense that I think the kick had obviously a view as to what they needed to raise in order to be able to make that project viable. and how that worked out into the annual payments. And they were then able to kind of apportion that amongst the buyers of services around the level that they kind of felt was right, and provided that information to us. And then I think the buyers, obviously, as kind of organisations that are interested in procuring that service, need to ensure that that level is right for them. And so we did, quite a lot of organisations did as well, to understand exactly how that benefit stacked up, and that resulted in us kind of proposing some changes to what was proposed by the KIC, to our kind of contribution to that, and then that obviously then in turn led to further amendments that the KIC needed to deliver to secure additional funding and revenues to meet the level that they needed to. And I guess one point on that is, an element of the grant funding was quite key in kind of pushing that forward, in that that's obviously reducing the amount of kind of investment funding that needs to be delivered. So kind of really blending the funding in that way was a key element to be able to make this kind of viable and go forward.
Thanks, James. I'm just looking at the time, and there's a lot of questions here, so I'm going to ask one, and then if any of the panelists have seen a question on here that they want to answer live, just give me a wave. I'm just going to pick, Archie had a couple more. I'm just going to group them together. Maybe this is for you, Dan H. What do you consider the key points in turning capital funding systems into revenue-based contracts for service providers? And what percentage of the project cost is required to set up and administer the SPV?
I'll take the second question first, quite an easy one. The SPV, we purposefully did it very light touch, an off-the-shelf community interest company. We set it up, cost 500 quid. We appointed the board later. So actually setting up the SPV doesn't cost very much at all if you don't make too much of a meal of it. And then the running of the SPV, that is actually subcontracted to the Rivers Trust. So the Rivers Trust are being paid, I think is it 10 grand a year, Dan, to run that for the 9 years. And that's sort of financial management, board meetings, VAT, company secretarial. So we've got to try and keep that sort of intermediary management cost quite low, because that's a cost of the whole project. So I think you can keep that quite low. On the first point, yeah, I mean, the whole purpose of this project really was to deliver a long-term intervention in the landscape, which requires a long-term contract with landowners to be paid for hosting and maintaining those interventions. So you've got to create this revenue stream for landowners to engage with this. And the question is, how do you do that? Because obviously in the past we've been able to fund capital works up front, but then what's the ongoing revenue stream? It traditionally has been a public subsidy. And if we're trying to bring private investment in, we've got to try and create a sort of privately funded long-term revenue stream. So the key to it is to match long-term buyer contract payments with long-term payments to landowners. You may raise the money up front and repay that money. I mean, the beauty of this project is at the end of year 9, if it all works out, we will have a debt-free natural flood management intervention in the catchment. And all the buyers, if they want to continue with this to maintain it in the catchment, can reduce their level of payment they've been paying for 9 years down by 80%. So from year 10 onwards, the buyers will have a much lower annual payment. The landowners will continue getting the same RPI-linked annual revenue. And the reason for that is you've probably dispensed with the use of the SPV, you've repaid all the investment, and you're now into something which can be left in the landscape for decades, potentially.
Thanks, Dan. Tom, do you have a comment?
Yeah, it was just another question from Matt Healy about, was there a conversation had with farmers about improving land management and the ability of healthy soils with improved organic content to infiltrate water and reduce some reliability, organic fertilizers. So yeah, we include this in all our NFM reports as a standard text, and as part of another project that we'll be delivering over the same period as this project, we'll be looking at that soil management and how they can better manage the soils to reduce the reliability on fertilizers and sort of improve soil pHs and things like that. So yeah, it's really crucial that we hit that target, even though it's not necessarily part of this project.
Thanks, Tom. So just opening it up, as we've got 3 minutes left, and there are quite a lot of questions here. What I think we'll do is we'll take these questions away that we don't get to, because I know that there's a very in-depth case study being developed. We don't know when it will come out, but it will. Hopefully these questions could sort of feed into that as well, and be answered within that. And were there any, just want to ask the panelists before we start to wrap up, were there any questions here that I've not posed that you wanted to answer? Sorry to make you look through it, but there's just, if any caught your eye, we can go through them. Otherwise we'll take them away and wrap up.
Helen, I think there's an interesting just one I just saw there. What happens if there's a catastrophic environmental event in, say, year 6? It's quite interesting to think about, and all the stakeholders would have thought about that. So there's some sort of hurricane comes across and washes everything out. What happens? The buyers are entitled to look at their contract and say, well, actually, what we're paying for is no longer in the catchment. We're going to pull out. The landowners are like, well, everything's gone, but it's not my fault. I was maintaining it. So what happens? And the reality of that situation probably is we haven't got enough money in the kick to replace that 1.5 million of interventions we put in on day one. So ultimately, it's a pretty disastrous scenario, but the buyers at that point probably pull out. The landowners more or less aren't penalised because it wasn't their fault that it all happened, and the investors would lose all their money. So that is a reality. I think someone has asked that question, and obviously none of us can force majeure event like that. It's interesting though where the risk falls. There is some risk to the buyers because they might well have paid for, say, 6 years for a flood intervention which doesn't exist anymore. So Jim might look back and go, well, that was a waste of your money, wasn't it? Because in year 7 we haven't got it anymore, and we need it even more now than we did at the start. So force majeure events, you know, affect everyone, I guess.
Thanks, Dan. I think that's something we don't talk about enough in a lot of these projects, actually, about sort of how we can sort of help mitigate that risk. I suppose we can't mitigate a hurricane. It's just what's coming.
We didn't look at insuring force majeure. Actually, that might be something people might want to do on larger projects in future, I guess.
Yeah. Tom, do you have a comment, or is there a question that caught your eye?
It was just a question, but it's a little bit of a can of worms, I think. It's from an anonymous attendee. I don't want to read it all out, but it's about just transitions, and we're entrenching inequalities by creating more revenue streams, profits for owners of capital, landowners and investors, in brackets. How do we make sure that communities benefit from public goods created? Well, it's quite an interesting topic in general, but if we think about it, we can't actually do this work without working with the landowners in the first place. We have no right to go onto any land and do anything, so we have to work with them. And you know, the fact that they've been paid over the last X years a basic payment, it may well be, you know, unjust. And you know, this kind of payment by results process makes it more just because they're actually going out there and doing something to provide these public goods. And in terms of communities benefiting from them, well, they'll benefit from them by reduced flood risk. And obviously, a lot of the communities use the river in terms of angling, swimming, canoeing, all the rest of it. They walk by the river, they walk in the catchment, they take part in events in the catchment. So they will benefit from all of those public goods, both directly and indirectly. So I think the key thing I would say there is that we have to work with the landowners. There is no other way of doing this, unfortunately.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom, for putting that in last minute. Right, so I see we're at 11:15. So we'll wrap up now. So there are more questions that we will take away and share with the panelists as they're thinking about putting together that more in-depth case study in the months ahead. We'll cover that. Just want to remind you that there have been many events about the Wyre project before that may answer some of your questions, and we can put some of those links up and send them to you with the slides today as well, just in case you sort of have some questions about how it was set up and things like that. I know we've answered some of those questions before. That's it. So just want to thank our panelists for their generous time today. Dan and James and Tom, thank you. And thanks for all these questions. There's so many great questions here. As mentioned, you'll find a recording up on the website early next week, greenfinanceinstitute.co.uk/GFI-Hive/events. And we're hoping to put up just a basic case study summarising what we've heard today and sort of information that's public about the Wyre project on the Hive site next 2 weeks. There's a question about where do you find that kind of information. We have information on case studies that have received private finance, and our partner Ecosystems Knowledge Network, it will be looking in future to do case studies on pilots. So those are two sources that you could go to. And that is it from me. So a really big thank you. I know it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of these projects, but thanks again, and hope you have a wonderful weekend when it gets here. Thanks.
So